The first sound is not trumpets, it's breathing. Hundreds of men dragging air through their teeth, steady at first, then stuttering. Mud sucks at boots. Harness creaks. Somewhere, a horse refuses the bit and screams. A priest lifts his hand to bless the ranks, and a man behind him vomits into the grass. Banners lift in the wind like torn wings. Across the field, the enemy moves. Not like heroes, but like a tide of iron and wood. Someone whispers a name you don't catch. Then the drums start. This is hidden by time. Medieval battles were not elegant duels on green hills. They were hours of noise and minutes of terror, hunger wrapped in steel, order collapsing into panic, and men discovering what fear does to the human spine. Chroniclers wrote about kings and miracles. The truth was sweat, mud, and breath. And the moment the line broke, mercy drowned in it. Before the first arrow flew, the battle had already begun. In the belly, most soldiers arrived half-starved, blistered, and coming off a night of no sleep. They stood in ranks that felt too tight to breathe, staring over shields that felt too small to live behind. Helmets narrowed vision to a keyhole. The world shrank to the ground at your feet, and the man's back in front of you. A commander waved a baton and shouted poetry about God and country. The ranker tried not to pass out. The field itself was a weapon. Commanders picked slopes that stole the enemy's breath, ditches that snapped ankles, clay that turned to glue when the sky sneezed. Caltrops hid in grass, stakes bristled like dead forests. A cart line could become a wall, a hedgerow, a trap, a stream, a grave. More battles were won by mud than by swords. The first shock was always sound. Horns, drums, the thunder of hooves. Then arrows, not elegant shafts sniping single throats, but storms. Tens of thousands hissing like rain. A black weather that punched through mail, tore faces, blinded eyes. You couldn't see the archer who killed you. You only saw the sky turn dark and the men around you fall like wheat. The second shock was weight. Armor didn't freeze you like a statue. The good stuff moved, but it cost breath. Every step with a shield felt like dragging a door through a swamp. Sweat boiled under steel in summer, froze in winter, and turned to salt in your eyes in between. When lines finally met, the weight multiplied. You weren't fencing. You were shoving, heaving, bracing. A scrum of ribs and wood and iron where blades were the punctuation, not the grammar. What did a shield wall feel like? Imagine a wooden fence that screams and bleeds. Spears jabbed over shoulders. Axes rose and fell. Men leaned with their whole lives. Feet slipped on something that wasn't water. You fought the man in front of you with your arms, and the man behind you with your spine. If you went down, a dozen boots argued with your ribs. Most deaths here were not pretty. They were weight and soil, and the slow, private, dark. Cavalry was terror on a schedule. You heard them long before you saw them. Drumming hooves, metal thunder, a sound that makes the gut forget how to be brave. A good line stood, angled spears, and turned horses into broken ladders. A bad line opened, and the charge braided through men like fire through dry thatch. Knights were not invincible. A ditch or a stake humbled them faster than a sermon, but when they broke through, the ground learned what bones sounded like. Crossbows and longbows changed the math. A peasant with a crossbow could kill a lord who'd trained since boyhood, if his hands stopped shaking long enough to wind the cord. A longbowman's fingers grew like roots and never healed straight again. Behind them, boys carried sheaves of arrows and learned to step over bodies without looking down. No one writes poems about the boys. They were too busy running. Command was colour and noise. Banners marked who you were and where to stand. Lose your banner, lose your spine. Signals were trumpets, drums, waving staffs, messengers on sweating horses, and lies. The fog of war wasn't a metaphor. It was fog, smoke, dust, and rumour. Men died obeying orders their captains never gave. Prayers were logistics in disguise. Before battle, priests walked the line, whispering Latin over mouths that tasted of fear. After battle, the same priests counted bodies, heard confessions from men too torn to kneel, and blessed pits wide enough to swallow a street. Saints took credit. Gravediggers did the work. There was a rule everyone pretended to follow: ransom the rich, finish the poor. If your armour gleamed and your name could buy bread, hands grabbed your wrist and shouted for quarter. If you were a levy with a bent spear and a muddy tunic, your plea became fertilizer. Mercy had a price, and most couldn't afford it. Panic spread faster than arrows. A gap opened. A banner tilted. Someone shouted, "We're flanked!" And suddenly, 1,000 men ran who didn't know why. Routes killed more than charges. The back turned to the blade is history's favourite target. Cavalry hunted the fleeing like wolves. Rivers turned into traps. Bridges became theatres of drowning. The bravest died first. The luckiest died last. Everyone else got trampled in between. Not all killing wore steel. Stones hammered down from village walls. Pitch burned through shields and skin alike. Trebuchets threw not just rocks, but messages. Barrels of filth. Headless warnings. Disease with a trajectory. Artillery, at the end of the age, wrote punctuation marks in gunpowder. Exclamation points where towers used to be. The chorus changed, not the song. What about heroes? They existed, for a heartbeat. A knight cut a path and vanished under 5 men with knives. A banner surged forward and disappeared in a red shrug. The stories kept their names. The mud kept their bodies. Between clashes, there were breaths. Leather creaked. Old wounds complained. Men stared at their hands like strangers. Black with someone else's blood. Trembling as if they belonged to a different animal. Water tasted like iron. Silence when it happened made everyone flinch. Camp followers stitched the world back together with blunt needles and boiled wine. Barber surgeons cut away what couldn't be saved and prayed over what shouldn't have lived. Arrowheads hid like seeds inside flesh. Hot irons lied about healing. Men thanked them and screamed anyway. Afterwards, the field looked like a storm had forgotten how to move. Bodies lay where they fell, armour shining stupidly in the sun. Crows arrived before the looters. The living walked among the dead and bartered with God. One more breath, one more day. I'll never do it again. They always did it again. Stripping the fallen was work. Buckles stuck with clotted promises. Knots of hair had to be cut where steel had loved too hard. Hands pried rings from fingers that didn't want to let go. The softest men learned how to be hard. The hardest men learned how to count. At dusk, heralds argued about names, while dogs learned new ones. Wagons creaked with wounded who sang to stay awake. Tents glowed like small, lying suns. Wine and prayer raced to see which would quiet the screams first. Neither won. Night simply smothered the noise. The next morning, the victors called it God's will. The losers called it treachery, mud, or fate. Chroniclers sharpened quills and smoothed the edges. A miracle here, a cowardice trimmed there, a king's decision polished until it gleamed. They trimmed the fat off memory and left the bone. Toward the end of the age, powder spoke a new language. Pike met shot. Plates met lead. Formations became hedgehogs. squares bristling against the charge. Drums learned new beats to teach feet to obey fear. Cannons broke walls in afternoons that once took seasons. But when the smoke blew sideways and lines met, the old truth returned. Men, too close to think, trying not to die. What actually happened in medieval battles? Men tried to stand where their feet didn't want to. They tried to hold a line made of breath and will. They tried to be braver than their bodies allowed. Sometimes they were. Most days, the ground decided. There were rules, and there were exceptions with knives. There were saints on banners and devils in ditches. There were kings who prayed over slaughter and peasants who bled for theology they couldn't pronounce. Honor rode at the front. Hunger carried the baggage. If you want a single picture, keep this one. A field the size of a village green. On it, 2,000 people who have not slept, most of whom will not see the next sunrise. The air alive with bees that are arrows, the ground coughing mud and men. A banner dips, not poetry, not destiny, just a tired arm, and 1,000 hearts misread the gesture and run. History calls it a flanking maneuver. The survivors call it what it was. The moment the world tilted. By night, the field is a mouthful of broken teeth. The living step carefully, saying names to keep the dead from learning theirs. Somewhere a boy searches for his father and finds only a buckle. Somewhere a priest whispers to bodies that can't hear him and writes a number he can't forget. Somewhere a king thanks God for favour and forgets to thank the ditch. Battles were not won by courage alone or lost by cowardice alone. They were decided by ground, weather, timing, rumour, and the first man who believed the sky was falling. They were decided by the cookfire that went out at dawn, the shoe that split at the ford, the spear that slid on sweat, the message that arrived 3 minutes too late. History loves a plan. The field loves an accident. And yet, inside all this wreckage, there were choices. A hand that steadied the man beside him instead of pushing past. A captain who held a line, one breath longer than fear requested. A rider who turned back for a stranger and changed a family's story. We forget them because they left no titles. We remember kings because parchment is kinder than mud. Walk those fields today and you'll see quiet grass, hedges, a plough dragging a neat scar across forgetfulness. But beneath your feet lie the iron filings of 1,000 lives. Rust turned to soil, names thinned to silence. If you listen when the wind ducks its head, you can almost hear it. Not trumpets, but breathing. The ordinary courage of men who stood until the earth decided otherwise. This was hidden by time. Subscribe for more stories. History tried to bury, because the past doesn't march in step. It breaks, it runs, it bleeds, and then it is still.